Dear beloved community, it's such a joy to be together with everybody this evening on the 30th day of August in the year 2020. Thank you so much for coming together to practice together as a community and to have a chance to hear the Dharma. Here in Mountain Spring, we're enjoying one of the first warm days we've had in quite a while. In fact, it almost feels as if spring is around the corner. In Australia, we start our seasons on slightly different days than in other places in the world, and we tend to start them on the first day of the month. So in Australia, spring officially starts tomorrow, which is a wonderful thing, and it definitely feels that way. As we were walking around here yesterday and today, so many trees are out in bloom. The leaves are starting to come back, and it felt so beautiful to be able to walk in the sun without a jacket on. Spring is returning in the world around and also in our hearts, and it's such a wonderful and beautiful thing to be celebrating. When we consider the Buddha's story, the story of Prince Siddhartha, we see a person who was sheltered from birth by his father. He was sheltered from all the ordinary sufferings of human life, the things that we experience as our day-to-day realities, especially at moments like this when we're in the middle of a pandemic. The sufferings of human life become so apparent and so real and so tangible for all of us. They're not abstractions anymore. But for the Prince Siddhartha, the story goes that he'd never come into contact with these things that we take for granted, suffering, old age, sickness, and death. These things that, although are part of our existence, we don't necessarily want to look at. But even though he was kept behind the palace walls and he was surrounded by luxury and protected from all pain, he was unsatisfied. And even though he wasn't experiencing those things, that deep dissatisfaction with all of the pleasures of life that he was surrounded by pushed him out from behind those palace gates, from behind those high walls, in order to discover the realities of life, to discover something more. And it's said that on these 4 journeys that the Buddha made out of the palace gates, out from behind the walls, he saw 4 things that shocked him to his core. He saw an old person, he saw a sick person, he saw a dying person, and he saw a monastic. I like to think that the sight of a monastic is not always such a shocking thing, but for the Prince Siddhartha it was. His father had sheltered him from seeing all of these things. These 4 sights in Buddhism are actually called the noble messengers. And these sights, these encounters awakened a deep longing, a deep yearning in the Prince Siddhartha, and he embarked on his spiritual journey, leaving behind the palace and all of the comforts that he enjoyed and entering the forest, entering the unknown as a renunciate. He wanted to understand birth. He wanted to understand old age, sickness, and death. He didn't want to forget them. In fact, rather than turning away from them, rather than having what I think any of us would understand to be somewhat of a human reaction, this reaction of turning away from something that was abhorrent, something that was scary, something that was completely unknown to him. He actually, it's said in the text that because he embarked on his journey of out of the palace gates, from the east gate, from the south gate, from the west gate, and the north gate, he actually circumambulated, in a sense. And so we can say, in a way, he circumambulated the things that he found challenging. Rather than seeing them as obstacles to be gotten rid of or forgotten, he actually considered them to be holy. And in Buddhism, the closest thing that we consider to be angels are these 4 noble messengers: old age, sickness, death, and a spiritual practitioner. The Buddha considered them to be noble messengers, considered them to be great messengers that called him forth. In a lot of ways, we might like to see on some level the story of Prince Siddhartha as our own story. This is a story that happens not only once in our lives, but that happens over and over again in each and every moment. That despite all of our best efforts of building up a wall that can be many feet high around ourselves, where we create a place where we're just in comfort all the time, life will touch us. And then it's a choice that we have. Do we allow ourselves to be touched and called forth into a more open heart, into a wider view, into a deeper understanding? Or do we build the walls up higher? And do we retreat deeper within the walls of our self-built palace? So I think it's important to ask ourselves as spiritual practitioners and moreover as Buddhist practitioners, who or what are the noble messengers in our lives? What calls us forth, not only once, but many times in our lives? What are the things, what are the situations that have awoken a sense of longing, this sense of search within us? And in order to allow ourselves to be called forth in some way, to be called forth on the real journey that we need to make, it's important to be able to recognize the places of our avoidance, the walls that we hide behind, whether they're the walls of ideas or opinions or other people or society's expectations. What are the places of our avoidance? Sometimes we avoid our suffering, we avoid pain, we avoid difficulty, and that is a natural human response. But there's another case in which, for some of us, we can identify with our pain and our suffering. It becomes one of our layers of self-identification. We hold on to a particular story, we hold on to a particular interpretation. It becomes something that we carry around rather than an invitation to look into. What are the undeniable core facts of your life, of life in general, that you're being called to look into, that your experiences are calling you to look into? These difficult, these painful, these challenging encounters that we've had. The Buddha had his encounter with old age, with death, with sickness, and so on. And those are really fundamental things. And for each of us, we're called to look into those things, but also into a number of unique things as well. So I wonder, what are the undeniable core facts of your life that you're called to look into? What are the aspects of life that also you don't want to look into? And I wonder what that might be, what the reasons for that might be. As I've shared before, this being called forth, growing and developing our understanding, looking into the assumptions that we have about ourselves, about life, about suffering, about happiness, is not a one-time thing, but it's a continual process of discovery, a continual process of being willing to be called forth. If we see Buddhism as an ever-expanding series of concentric circles, and each of those concentric circles expands on and contains the one before, then the Four Noble Truths are the very core, the very essence, the center of Buddhism, the very essence of the insight that gives rise to all of the teachings and practices that are elaborated on in Buddhism. In fact, the Venerable Shariputra, one of the Buddha's senior disciples, once said, "Friends, just as the footprints of all legged animals can be encompassed by the footprint of the elephant, which is the foremost in terms of size, in the same way, all skillful qualities are gathered under the Four Noble Truths." Under which four? Under the noble truth of dukkha, suffering. Under the noble truth of the origination of dukkha. Under the noble truth of the cessation of dukkha. Under the noble truth of the path of practice leading to the transformation of dukkha. The Four Noble Truths are an expression of the very essence of the Buddha's insight, a heart teaching in a way. And at the same time, in addition to being a heart teaching, an expression of the insight of the Buddha, they're a recognition that each of us has the capacity to realize the same insight for ourselves. In that way, these Four Noble Truths, rather than being a dogma, a theory, or an ideology, are an invitation and an encouragement for us to wake up right in the heart of each and every moment. Let's have a sound of the bell. Every single teaching and practice that's been elaborated in Buddhism is a response to the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths express the fundamental, very essential insight of Buddhism, and that is that sensory contact. And we've spoken a lot in previous talks about sensory input and responses to sensory input. Sensory contact without awareness generally gives rise to holding on to and craving for temporary states and things, which we tend to mistake for happiness, but which by their very nature will be unsatisfactory and painful, or dukkha. And this tendency of our mind, of our consciousness, sustains something that we call samsara, this endless round, this repeated cycle of bhava, of becoming something, or of habit energies, or as I like to call them, the tracks in the carpet. This tendency to always want to become something other than what we are right now. And along with these deep tendencies is the tendency towards birth. In Pali, it's jati, which can be interpreted as either rebirth, not only at one fixed point in the future, but in each and every moment. Or on a deeper and more subtle level, when we speak about birth, there's another level of understanding this, rather than just thinking about shedding a physical body and taking on a new physical body. There's another more subtle level, even beyond the subtle level of being born and dying in each and every moment. But on a more subtle level, there can be an understanding of jati, of birth, of the coming to be of a new manifestation in each and every moment, such as the arising of a mental formation, or the rising of a sense of self in each and every moment, a sense of grasping, holding on to an idea and defining ourselves by it in each and every moment. This can be another way of understanding this process of birth, also in addition to the physical aspects or the continuation aspects. By applying the Four Noble Truths as a lens through which to look deeply at our experience, which is really the Buddha's invitation for us as Buddhist practitioners, we begin to recognize and to understand this endless internal and external round of samsara. In the Digha Nikaya, the long length sayings of the Buddha shares our situation very clearly. He says, friends, it's through not realizing, through not penetrating the Four Noble Truths, that this long course of birth and death has been passed through and undergone by me as well as you. What are these four? They're the noble truth of dukkha, of suffering, the noble truth of the origin of dukkha, the noble truth of the cessation of dukkha, and the noble truth of the way to the cessation of dukkha. But now, friends, that these have been realized and penetrated, cut off is the thirst for continuing this cycle, and destroyed is that which leads to renewed becoming, and there's no fresh becoming or bhava. The Four Noble Truths taught by the Buddha are not things to believe, not doctrines to believe or to recite, but realities to be open to see and to reflect on, and most importantly, to respond to appropriately. These Four Noble Truths, in Buddhism, we see them as four realities that are the fundamental dimensions of experience as seen by the Buddha. A person with deep wisdom, the nature of the conditioned world, that which gives rise to the conditioned world, the reality that it's possible to transform, which is good news indeed, and the way to do this. So they're very practical and very concrete, and not things that we need to struggle to understand, but invitations to apply as a contemplation in each and every moment of our daily life. In fact, in the Buddhist view, the whole purpose of spiritual practice is for each of us, that's you and me, to realize for ourselves the nature of reality. This is really important, so maybe I'll say it again. The whole purpose of the practice is for each of us to realize for ourselves the nature of reality. Not to hold on faith or just to believe something because somebody else told us that it's like that, even if that person is the Buddha. But to actually generate this liberating insight for ourselves right in this very life. Do you believe that you can do it? The Buddha certainly believed that you could. I truly believe that one of the biggest challenges for our spiritual life and our spiritual development is this deep sense of ill will towards ourselves in the aspect of not having confidence in our own capacity to wake up, of thinking that we won't be able to wake up, we won't be able to transform, we won't be able to understand our situation. The Buddha certainly believed that it was possible. And so he taught tirelessly for 45 years, knowing that we had the capacity to wake up. And now the real question is for us to be able to embrace that, to be able to acknowledge to ourselves once and for all that we can do it, and then to actually do it. Each of us has had the opportunity to meet a good teacher, such as Tai, to have heard the Dhamma, to have been able to understand the Dhamma even just a little bit. Something resonated. It might have just been a sentence or a word or two, but some aspect of the Dhamma penetrated. And now the only issue remaining, perhaps it's the most important issue, is whether we're willing, since we have the capacity, the Buddha said that, we have the capacity to wake up. The only issue is whether we're actually willing to put these transformative practices, to whatever extent we understand them, into practice. To do this, I really feel we need to cultivate a willingness and a capacity to allow our blind spots to be revealed. A good teacher, such as Tai, will always call us forth. They'll call us forth in some way from our habit energies, from our tracks in the carpet, our habitual ways of seeing things or responding to things. And at the same time, a good teacher will always point us back to the teacher in ourselves, helping us to recognize our own capacity. A good teacher will always remind you that you can do it and will point the way for you or for us to walk. The kindness of such a teacher is very deep. And that kindness can manifest in many ways, sometimes gentle, most often gentle, but sometimes quite strong and quite fierce. I might have told this story before, but if I did, it's on my heart to tell again this evening. When I was a novice, I was going through a period of suffering, and I went and had a consultation with Thay. After sharing what I needed to, he turned to me and he said, "Please don't come here and waste my time with questions that you already know the answer to." And then he kicked me out of the hut. Now, I'll admit that I was a bit slow on the uptake. I came into the hut wanting Thay to say, when I reflect on it, I realized I wanted Thay to say, "Oh, poor you. There, isn't that terrible? I'm so sorry for you. Let me take that away." But he didn't do that. For me, he was quite strong in that moment, and I was quite upset with Thay as a young practitioner. I wanted to be comforted. I wanted all of these things, and so when I left Thay's hut, there was a pathway with gravel on it, and I'll never forget that as I walked out of the hut, I kicked the gravel because I was so upset with Thay. Why doesn't Thay understand me? Why is Thay kind to everybody except me? And all of these these stories. Maybe my roots are not very deep. So it took me a week or so of walking around, of breathing, of looking deeply, until I finally realized what Thay had done for me. It was actually true that when I came to Thay with my question, with my suffering, that I knew what I needed to do. I just didn't want to do it. I wanted somebody to give me the easy way out, or some other kind of way. In that moment, by giving me that strong teaching, Thay had actually done what the Buddha has done for each one of us. Thay reminded me of my own capacity, which might have been only very small, but reminded me of my capacity, the capacity to be able to understand my situation, to be able to understand what I needed to do and what I didn't need to do in order to transform my situation. If Thay had laid out everything and said, do this, do this, do this, do this, I probably wouldn't have really received the teaching in the same way. I maybe might not have valued it in the same way. Rather than developing a sense of dependency in me, or subservience and secondhand knowledge, Thay awoke that sense of confidence in me. When you think of the great teachers, the really great teachers of your life, are the truly great teachers the ones who just confirm what you already think you know, that spoon feed us sweet nothings, or are they the ones that challenge us in some way? And a great teacher might be a person, it might be a painful situation. As for me, every single day, I'm so grateful that I've had the chance to meet and to practice with such a kind and loving teacher such as Thay, as well as to have had many experiences in my life that are also teachers, that pull out the ground from under my feet so that I could touch true security. This is why I think to be a meditation practitioner, to embark fully on your journey of discovery, to be willing to look deeply into your life, it's a tremendous thing. It's an amazing thing. It's the most important and also the most scary. Since we need to be willing to walk outside of those self-imposed palace gates from all the things that we've told ourselves or that we've been told are comfort, The things that we've been told are real. The things that we've been told or we think are true. We step out of all of those false comforts into the real comfort. I've told the story before also, I think, of myself as a young monk sharing with Pei some of my complaints about this and that in my spiritual life. And he sat quietly for a moment and smiled at me and said, you know, Brother Phap Hai, you really need to stop running around after the small comforts and look for the big comfort. When we look at the Buddha's teaching career, which spanned over more than 4 decades, we see that he offered so many precious teachings. He didn't just offer the insights, but he also offered a very concrete and comprehensive way for us to be able to realize these insights in our life. What kindness. And now, as students of the Awakened One, our invitation is to respond. All of the teachings the Buddha offered are expansions on the insights contained in his very first teaching, his very first public teaching, I should say, which is called the Discourse on the Turning of the Dharma Wheel, which I suggest and I really recommend that you read for yourself in its entirety. And you might like to do that this week. But for tonight, I'll just read a short-ish excerpt since it's such a rich and meaningful text. And you can find the entire text for yourself in the Samyutta Nikaya, number 56. So at one time, the Buddha was staying near Benares in the Deer Park. Then the Buddha addressed the group of 5 mendicants. Friends, these 2 extremes should not be cultivated by one who has gone forth. Which 2? Indulgence in sensual pleasures, which is pointless, and indulgence in self-mortification, which is pointless. Avoiding these 2 extremes, the realized one woke up by understanding the middle way, which leads to vision and knowledge, leads to peace, direct knowledge, awakening, and extinguishment. What is that middle way? It's simply this noble 8-fold path. That is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right immersion or right concentration. This is that middle way, which gives vision and knowledge, leads to peace, direct knowledge, awakening, and extinguishment. Now this is the first noble truth, the truth of suffering. Birth is suffering. Old age is suffering. Illness is suffering. Death is suffering. Association with the disliked is suffering. Separation from the liked is suffering. Not getting what you wish for is suffering. In brief, the 5 skandhas are suffering. Now this is the second noble truth of the origin of suffering. It's the thirst and the craving for becoming that creates and continues this round of existence. That is the 3 forms of craving. Craving for sense pleasures, craving for continue this round of birth, and craving to end existence. Now this is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. It's the fading away and cessation of that very same thirst and craving with nothing left over. Letting it go, giving it away, releasing it, and not holding on to it. Now this is the noble truth of the practice that leads to the cessation, the ending of suffering. It's simply the noble 8-fold path. That is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right immersion. This is the noble truth of suffering. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the wisdom, the realization, and the light that arose in me regarding teachings not learned from another. This noble truth of suffering should be completely understood. Such was the vision that arose in me. This noble truth of suffering has been completely understood. Such was the vision that arose in me. This is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. Such was the vision that arose in me. This noble truth of the origin of suffering should be given up. Such was the vision that arose in me. This noble truth of the origin of suffering has been given up. Such was the vision that arose in me. This is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. That was the vision that arose in me. This noble truth of the ending of suffering should be realized. That was the vision that arose in me. This noble truth of the cessation of suffering has been realized. Such was the vision that arose in me. And this is the noble truth of the practice that leads to the ending of suffering. This was the vision that arose in me. This noble truth of the practice that leads to the ending of suffering should be developed. This was the vision that arose in me. This noble truth of the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering has been developed. This was the vision, knowledge, wisdom, realization, and the light that arose in me regarding teachings not learned before from another. Let's have a sound of the bell. In this excerpt from that beautiful discourse, the very first public teaching offered by the Buddha, we see a lot of emphasis on the word dukkha. Please note the pronunciation, dukkha. We Aussies have a tendency to pronounce it dukkha, which is like a dry dip that we mix olive oil and dip our bread into. It's like a dip. It's not dukkha, it's dukkha. But speaking of bread, a sandwich in Australia is called a sanga. Like a Vegemite sanga is a Vegemite sandwich. And so many Aussies, I've realized since coming here, so many Aussies refer to the practice community as a sanga. While the sangha is nourishing, it's not a sanga, it's not a sandwich. So it might be a good idea to spend a few moments to understand some of the roots of this word dukkha, which we hear often in Buddhism. And sometimes it's almost recited like a mantra, dukkha, anicca, anatta, suffering, impermanence, non-self. It's sometimes recited. Let's look a little bit more deeply into the meaning of it. Sukha, of course, is happiness and bliss, and dukkha is, it could be said, is the opposite of that. It can be translated as being ultimately unsatisfactory, even though it might be pleasurable for a moment, but that moment won't last. It can be translated as suffering, it can be translated as painful, and so on. So concretely, what is dukkha according to the text? One of the most pithy summations of dukkha in the Buddha's very first teaching is this. The Buddha says, now this, friends, is the noble truth of dukkha. Birth is dukkha. And remember, we spoke of physical birth, but we also spoke of the coming to be of things, whether it's mental formations and so on. Aging is dukkha. Death is dukkha. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha. Association with the unpleasant is dukkha. Separation from the loved is dukkha. Not getting what is wanted is dukkha. In short, the 5 aggregates, the 5 skandhas are dukkha. And then Sariputra, one of the Buddha's senior disciples, gives a beautiful elaboration on each of these categories of dukkha that the Buddha mentions in that pithy excerpt from the discourse on turning the Dharma wheel. Sariputra says, and what is birth? Whatever birth, taking birth, coming to be, coming forth, appearance of aggregates, the 5 skandhas, and acquisition of sense experiences and reactions to those sense experiences of living beings, that's called birth. So that little explanation right there is enough to practice with for a very long time, to be able to apply as a lens in our life, to understand how birth is constantly taking place in terms of the reactions of and manifestations of mental formations in conjunction with sense input, sensory impressions, tastes, smells, sensations in the body, and so on. And then what is aging? Whatever aging, decrepitude, brokenness, graying, wrinkling, decline of life force, weakening of the faculties of ourselves and various beings, that is called aging. So this also can be a very powerful and wonderful transformation, to be able to contemplate these categories of aging within our own experience, to consider aspects of graying, aspects of wrinkling, aspects of decline of the life force, weakening of the faculties of living beings, and that includes ourselves. And we can go through our faculties and consider, how are my faculties of sight compared to how they were a year or 2 years or 10 years ago? How about the way that I move around? How about my smell? How about my hearing? And so on. And what is death? Whatever passing away, whatever breaking up, disappearance, dying, death, completion of time, breakup of the aggregates in some way, casting off of the body, and interruption in the life force is called death. So we can see many aspects to death here, and not just physical death, but on a deeper level, the passing away of whatever has come to be, whether those things are mental formations or ideas, or whether certain conditions of our life, not just death of a person or our own death, but anything that arises also has its moment of passing away, of transforming into something else. So seeing this process of birth and death not only as something that just occurs in a physical body, but that's also occurring around us in every moment. And what is sorrow? Sariputra asks and responds. Whatever sorrowing, sadness, inward sorrow, inward sadness of anyone suffering from misfortune, touched by a painful thing, that's called sorrow. And what is lamentation? Whatever crying, grieving, lamenting, weeping, wailing, lamentation of anyone suffering from misfortune, touched by a painful thing, that's called lamentation. And what's pain? Whatever is experienced as bodily pain, bodily discomfort, pain or discomfort born of bodily contact, that is called pain. And what is distress? Whatever is experienced as mental pain, mental discomfort, pain or discomfort born of mental contact, that's called distress. And what is despair? Whatever despair, despondency, desperation of anyone suffering from misfortune, touched by a painful thing, that's called despair. And what is association with the unpleasant? There's the case where undesirable, unpleasing, unattractive sights, sounds, aromas, flavors, or tactile sensations occur. Or one has connection, contact, relationship, interaction with those who wish one ill, who wish for one's harm, who wish for your discomfort, who wish one no security from heaviness. This is called the suffering, the stress of association with the unbeloved. And then there's the separation from the loved, when we're separated from those sights, sounds, aromas, and sensations that are pleasing, that when we have no contact, no connection, and no relationship or interaction with those who wish us well, those who wish for our benefit, those who wish for our comfort, who wish us security from heaviness, nor with our parents, our brothers, our sisters, our friends, our companions on the path, or our relatives. This is called the dukkha of separation from the loved. And what is the dukkha of not getting what is wanted? In beings who are subject to birth, the wish arises, may we not be subject to birth, and may birth not come to us. But this is not to be achieved by wanting alone. This is the pain of not getting what's wanted. In being subject to aging, illness, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair, the wish arises, may we not be subject to these things. But this is not to be achieved just by wanting. This is the dukkha of not getting what's wanted. And finally, what are the 5 skandhas that are unsatisfactory? That's the skandha of form, the skandha of feeling, the skandha of perception, the skandha of mental formations, and the skandha of consciousness. These are the 5 skandhas that are painful. And this, dear friends, is the noble truth. So Sariputra gave a very detailed expansion of the Buddha's pithy teaching. And this is a very helpful expansion to take as a contemplation for our spiritual life, to take each of these categories and to consider them in light of our own experience. If you'd like to find this, you can find it in the Middle Length Sayings 141. Sometimes people say that Buddhism is pessimistic because of its awareness of and emphasis on dukkha. I might be a contrary person, it's always possible, but I actually would say that Buddhism is optimistic because the Buddha says that from this situation, when we recognize this situation, each one of us, every living being, you, have the capacity to transform our situation through generating the insight of the 4 Noble Truths in our daily life. In the 4 Noble Truths, we see an invitation into the empowering understanding of cause and effect, of skillful and unskillful in each and every moment. In each experience, each encounter, we apply the lens of the 4 Noble Truths in order to understand the reality of dukkha, which is basically an unskillful effect, to go along with what I shared earlier about understanding the skillful and the unskillful. So dukkha, this unsatisfactoriness, this pervading sense of momentary pleasure that won't last forever, is an unskillful effect. And then the truth of the origination of dukkha is an unskillful cause. And then the truth of the cessation, the ending of dukkha, is a skillful effect. And then the truth of the path, the Noble Eightfold Path, which leads to transforming this round of dukkha, this round of samsara, is a skillful cause. Each of the truths is a very practical and concrete practice. Dukkha, your suffering, not just a general idea of suffering, but clearly directing our attention to whenever we experience something in the categories mentioned above, is to be understood. The root of that suffering understood and released and transformed. The realization that this is possible to transform this suffering, and the concrete path to transforming your suffering put into practice. Let's have a sound of the bell. in order to practice the Four Noble Truths in a concrete way, it's important to understand something that we read when we read the excerpt from the discourse on turning the Dharma wheel. And that is that there are three stages, or as they're called in Buddhism, the turnings of the wheel, with regard to each of the Four Noble Truths. These, of course, as I just said, are mentioned in the first discourse of the Buddha, and we read them out earlier. So these three turnings of the wheel, these three stages of practice and insight with each of the Four Noble Truths generate a total of 12 insights. So the first in Pali is called Satchanyana. It means knowing the nature of the truth. Sometimes it's called the acknowledgement, the view, or the reflection. Basically recognizing the reality of this truth in your life. So recognition. That's the first turning of the wheel with regard to each of the Noble Truths. And the second is Kichanyana. It means knowing from that recognition of its truth in your life, this moment of, oh, I get it. I see what's going on. That's a wonderful thing already, but it's not necessarily going to transform our situation unless we have the next turning of the wheel, which is knowing what needs to be done in connection with that realization. Traditionally, this turning of the wheel is called the practice, the motivation, the directly experiencing, or sometimes it's called the encouragement. And then the third is Katanyana. It means accomplishing what needs to be done. For example, the result, the full understanding, the knowing. This is a big one for many of us. There are times that we recognize the situation and we know what needs to be done, but we're unwilling or just a little bit hesitant to take that step. Like the story I told earlier of myself coming to Thay as a young novice. We know what needs to be done. Part of us knows, but sometimes we're unwilling to actually do it because in some ways it's a little scary to step out of those comforts, those places that we define ourselves by. So this third level is called the realization. It's when that truth, the first noble truth, the second noble truth, the third noble truth, or the fourth noble truth comes to fruition, when that process of realizing it in your life, of knowing what needs to be done, and then putting that into practice, and then realizing the fruit comes to fruition. It's not a one-time thing, but it's a process that occurs over and over again. So with the first noble truth, we see in a very simple way that the first noble truth is the truth that there is dukkha, the truth of the round of samsara, this endless round of the same thing over and over again, of momentary satisfaction. We see that the Buddha told us that birth on all its different levels of understanding is suffering, is dukkha. Aging is dukkha. Illness is dukkha. Death is dukkha. Connection with what is displeasing is dukkha. Separation from what is pleasing is dukkha. To not get what we want is dukkha. And the five aggregates are dukkha. And it's worth asking yourself as a practitioner, understanding that underpinning all of this dukkha is the realization that it's our attachment to, or our search for things, our craving for things that generate dukkha. Does it mean that absent this quality of craving, that aging in and of itself is dukkha? It might be samsara, but is it dukkha? Is illness in and of itself dukkha, or is it our response to illness? It's an interesting thing to contemplate, and I'll leave that with you. As Buddhist practitioners, let's make a commitment to ourselves and to each other that from now on, we're going to stop moaning and complaining about dukkha. It's part of the way things are in this samsaric realm. In this realm, there's nothing wrong with dukkha. It's to be understood. In fact, that's the encouragement of this first noble truth. It is to be understood. It is a noble messenger. If we really take on board the concrete and empowering practice of the Four Noble Truths, then within the context of this first noble truth, suffering is to be fully understood, and the task or the practice that it assigns us is that of complete understanding, of being completely transparent to the situation. In that way, it's a great teacher. The noble truth of dukkha, of this quality of being incapable of satisfying, it's the basic insight that samsara, life in this everyday world with its clinging and its craving to impermanent states or things, is dukkha itself, unsatisfactory and painful, and of expecting happiness from things that are impermanent is not ever going to solve the situation. So it'll only give us at best a momentary taste. This is the insight of the first noble truth. So as a solid practitioner, rather than blaming everyone and everything, including ourselves, a solid practitioner will practice to look deeply and understand each situation of our life from within, as honestly and thoroughly as possible. In terms of the first noble truth, the truth that there is suffering, the three turnings of the wheel are, the first is recognition. That's to clearly see the situation for what it is. To recognize suffering when it's suffering. To call it by its true name. To recognize what's going on. And then the second turning of the wheel, the encouragement turning of the wheel, is the sense of, I have the capacity to understand this situation. I can do it. I've been given enough tools, in fact, more than enough tools to do it. And now I just need to apply these tools skillfully. This is a real Rosie the Riveter, yay me moment. I can do it. And not only I can do it, but I'm going to take concrete steps to do it. To know what I need to do and what I don't need to do, and then to actually do it, to take steps, to experiment, or as Tay has said, to be an intelligent practitioner. And the third is the realization, coming to an understanding of the situation. We understand, even on a superficial level, at first, how a situation came to be. What were the causes and conditions that gave rise to that situation? We might even, as we contemplate the arising of suffering or dukkha in our life, in one of the categories that we spoke of before, we might even use a lens such as the four nutriments, which is an incredibly powerful tool for us to understand the ways that we experience and co-create suffering in our lives. So this week when we're considering dukkha, the different manifestations of dukkha, and also the manifestations of sukha, of happiness, of ease, of delight, of bliss in our lives, I'd like to invite each of my friends, whenever you experience something painful, unpleasant, unsatisfying, it might even be something slight, just like an itch, and you just want to get rid of it, something that you want to get rid of. That's also a form of dukkha. Take a moment to consider which kind of dukkha it is. Become curious about it. And then to apply the three turnings of the wheel with regard to this first noble truth. And let's see what happens. I wish you every success this week, dear community. It's been a delight to share with you, and I hope something has been useful for you this evening. We'll end with the sound of the bell.